But let's undo that. Long story short, I could start tinkering and change the aesthetics of this. But functionally, that just will get boring quickly. So let me wave my hand at the remainder of the attributes that you can tinker with. But it's the kind of obvious things, size and weight and other things. So what else might I want to do here? Let me go up to the identity inspector, which is this icon to the left of the attributes inspector. And I'm not going to change anything here. But notice that there's a hint of the relationship between this drag and drop interface and code. I've highlighted the text field that I dragged and dropped. I've gone to the identity inspector. And Xcode is hinting to me that the type of object I have effectively instantiated or alloced by dragging and dropping is what? It's apparently a UI text field. So we'll see in a bit, I could actually write lines of code that alloc a UI text field, and in code tell it to go to 10 pixels from the top, 20 pixels from the left, and I could actually do all of this programmatically. Xcode's purpose in life is just to simplify this process, at least for newbies early on, to help get you started quickly with a more user-friendly UI. So unfortunately, I've made my UI, simple though it is, but it doesn't actually do much. Let's see what it does do. Let me go ahead and hit the play button. That'll spawn the simulator, assuming I've made no syntax errors. Pretty good so far. Looks like I expected. I'm going to click on name. And notice I get the keyboard for free. Because it's a text field, Apple knows that when you give focus to it by clicking or touching on it, if it were an actual phone, they pop up the keyboard. I can start saying something like D-A-V-I-D. Notice it's going to try to do autocorrect for me. So that's kind of a nice feature. And now I click go, and of course nothing happens, right? Because what should happen? We haven't told the program what to do. So we have to somehow now associate that button and that text field with actual code. So where might we do this? So henceforth, even though you could put code in the app delegate, and in fact, let me just clean this up and get rid of all superfluous stuff. Even though you could put code in the app delegate, in the header file or the M file, you typically won't. You'll typically immediately hand off control from the app delegate to a view controller, a root view controller, and isolate your code there. There's some cases where that's not going to be the case, but for now, think of a breakable rule of thumb that you should start writing all of your code in the view controller and not start embedding stuff in the app delegate, partly by convention here, per the MVC paradigm we just mentioned earlier. So what should I put where? So if I'm going to put almost all of my code in the view controller class, that means it should go in the H file and in the M file. But currently, these files look like this in the H file and in the M file, which looks like this. And honestly, this is really uninteresting. I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to get rid of the private category, the semi-private category. I mean, this class literally does nothing. But I need a way of somehow linking this class with that user interface. I need some kinds of like extension cord that wires the nib, the UI, with my code. And so the mechanism that Apple offers for this is something called an IB outlet, for Interface Builder Outlet. And you can kind of think of it as a socket into which you can plug a cable to somehow wire these two things together. So the paradigm for doing that essentially boils down to declaring properties. So what I'm going to do in my viewController.h file, inside of my class declaration here, I'm going to go ahead and start typing property. And I'm going to know in advance it's going to be non-atomic strong. In the future, we'll think harder about that. But for now, let's just go on faith and say that it's non-atomic and strong or strong non-atomic. The order does not matter. IB outlet. And then UI text field. And let me close this window over here to give me some more room. Star text field, semicolon. All right. Does this look like a valid declaration? Exactly. So this is a bad sign. If I click at that expected semicolon at edge and declaration list, it actually doesn't quite know what I'm talking about here. Let's try to fix that. IB outlet, resave, problem goes away. When in doubt, simply changing things in Xcode doesn't necessarily mean Xcode will notice, but generally saving the file will mean it will reanalyze your code and get rid of any warnings or errors. OK. So what does this mean? Well, a property is just a means by which we can synthesize a getter and a setter and give us dot notation access to some instance variable. By convention, what is the instance variable going to be called that is behind the scenes for this property? Anyone recall or know? This used to be more explicit, but more recent versions of iOS just kind of do this for us. By convention, what Apple... Oh, what's underscore text fields? Yes. So by default, what Apple does these days is if you declare a property called text field, they will create for you a UI text field star underscore text field instance variable for you inside of the object. But we shouldn't have to know or care about that because the property gives us getter and setter access to it. But just FYI. OK, so what is an IB outlet? Well, what's interesting is because I typed IB outlet, notice this little circle that appeared here. Let me get rid of IB outlet, hit save, it goes away. Let me put it back, save, and come on, comes back. So notice, this is kind of cute. If can I do this here? Damn it. I need to have two windows open. We'll come back to why that's cute. All right, so how do I actually now connect? And that represents the sort of socket that I alluded to earlier. How do we actually connect that line of code to my nib file? So we can do this in a couple of ways, but what I'm going to do is first, let's say, go to my nib file over here. And I'm going to expand this window here. And this is a little complex at first, but now I am in viewcontroller.nib, which gives me my user interface that we defined earlier. And now notice on the left-hand side, we get this little cheat sheet of placeholders where I have the objects in my view. Now, what does this mean? For now, notice that, and I'm going to just drag this over here so they're side by side. This big rectangle is itself a UI view. Where did it come from? It just came with the template. I got a default UI view rectangle by default. I then started dragging and dropping stuff on there. Case in point, I'm going to delete the go, and notice the placeholder at top left is about to disappear. So that's where it came from. So if I go back to my little menu on the right-hand side, and I grab myself another rounded rectangular button, drag it here, notice it reappears under view. And that's because this is indeed something akin to a canvas. They gave me a blank canvas at first. It was gray. Then I made it white. And then I started dragging and dropping different layers or objects on top of it. And that's the hierarchical representation of that. Constraints we'll wave our hands at for now. That just has to do with supporting devices of different sizes, like an iPhone like this, an iPhone like this, or an iPad. But those are given to me by default just to help me out. And now up here is something called files owner and first responder. We'll ignore first responder for now, but files owner refers to the class that has ownership of this nib. So per our discussion earlier, which class owns this nib or uses this nib to load its views? The view controller. So really, that icon, which is like a yellow cube, is just an iconic representation of my class. It just represents my code. Now, why is this useful? Well, notice if I click on Control here and then start dragging, notice that this little, we'll call it an extension cord, starts to appear. This blue line starts to appear, and it wants to lock on to things over here. And I'm going to go ahead and hover over the text field, and I'm going to let go. And now notice Xcode tells me that I have a few outlets that I can plug this blue cable into, one of which is called text field, one of which is called view. The fact that there's a little minus sign there means something's already plugged in there. Just don't touch it. That's what came with by default when we got this whole view. But text field looks familiar, right? That was the name I gave to what? That was the name I gave to the property that I typed out in the H file. So simply by selecting with my mouse text field, I now get some kind of association. The line goes away, but there's some kind of association made between the file's owner, aka viewcontroller.m or .h, and that particular widget inside of my view. It's like I've plugged one into the other. So what does this really mean? This means that when I run this program, my property called text field, which is of what type? It's a pointer, which means it's meant to store an address. So what I have just done with this drag and drop interface is I've told Xcode, when you load my program, and when you load this big rectangle, and you start plopping the text field there, and you put the go button there, the last thing I need you to do before you hand control to my application is figure out what is the address in RAM of that text field that you dropped there for me, what is the address of that button that you dropped there for me, and put the address of the former, the text field, where? inside of the property that I declared called text field, which is a 64-bit chunk of memory in which I want the address of that text field. So again, all Interface Builder is doing for us is kind of simplifying, dumbing down, if you will, the process by which I can create a user interface. And it is going to do for me the process of allocing that UI text field, figuring out what the return value of alloc is after initializing it, and then putting that 64-bit memory address into my property. And that is, again, what the dragging and dropping and that blue line have done for us. It saved me the trouble of doing the assignment operator somewhere in code to figure out the address of that UI text field. So what's the implication of this? Well, the implication is we can do one other thing. It's one thing to have a connection from my code to Interface Builder. Why is that useful? It means I can probably programmatically ask the user interface for what? The value. So if the user types something in, much like in jQuery or JavaScript, you can ask a DOM node, what is its dot value? Similarly now in Objective-C, can I programmatically ask what is the value of what the human typed into that text field? Because I have a connection from my code to the text field. But that's not quite enough to make an application that allows me to type in my name and then see a prompt on the screen. Because in order to inform the program that I have typed a word, what's the human convention? To hit like enter or hit the go button. So I somehow need a cable going from that go button back to my code. So the opposite of an IB outlet is what we'll call an IB action. And I declare that in my H file as follows. Dash, because it's going to be an instance method, IB action. And now notice Xcode's trying to be helpful. Let me do that again. IB action. Notice that it's encouraging me to give the selector. Selector is a fancy way of saying method name, colon ID sender. So we'll come back to ID sender in a moment. I'm going to go ahead and call this something somewhat arbitrary, go. This is the method I want the UI to call when I click that go button. Now ID sender, this it turns out is just a convention now. IB actions, if you read the documentation, state that when an IB action, aka method, is called as a result of a user doing something with the user interface, that method, called go in this case, but it could have been called anything, is passed a pointer to what, do you think? To the object that was touched on the screen. So it's a way of potentially having multiple buttons, for instance, all invoke the same method, but I can somehow identify which one of them was actually touched. Maybe those buttons have different meanings on the screen. In this case, it's moot, because I just have one. But if I had multiple, that would be useful. What is an ID? It's a data type, recall. Yeah? It's not necessarily a void pointer. It is a pointer that can be nil. So ID is like saying void star, for those of you who knew C or C++ before. But it's a pointer that can also be nil. So this is sort of the common Objective-C way of saying this is a pointer, but it might be nil. It might not be a valid value. OK, so I'm done with that. Oh, and now notice, here's where it got useful. Because I have this circle now, notice it's filled in. That's because I've plugged something in to the outlet with that little blue line. All right, so IB action go. All right, I'm really eager now. I'm going to go ahead and click run here. All right, I'm going to see my UI in the simulator. And notice for some reason the latest version of the iOS simulator is slow to start, but here it is now. I'm going to go ahead and, very exciting, D-A-V-I-D, go. Why is it not working? Yeah, I didn't link it, right? All I did was declare a method that happened to be called go, but I made no programmatic connection between that method and the UI. And indeed, the little cute circle here is still empty. We haven't wired those two things together. So let me go back to my nib file. And actually notice, Xcode's pretty good. Xcode underneath the hood uses a compiler called Clang, whose error messages are pretty decent and pretty human-friendly. Incomplete implementation, it's slapping me on the wrist for having done exactly what we identified as the problem already. So if you get this here, notice it took my files away. Not a problem. See the little folder icon at top? Click that, and I'm back where I expect to be. Let me go to my nib file. And now notice, this time, I want the arrow, the blue line to go in the other direction. I want the button to be linked to my code so that messages can be sent from button to code. So again, I'm going to hold Control. I'm going to click on Go. And now notice, little blue line starts to form. and it wants to cling to a few things.